The Detroit Red Wings are looked at over the last few decades as one of the greatest teams in hockey. But the reality is that there had to be a darkest before the dawn moment. And it was more than just a moment, it was a season. It was an entire season. And for Detroit, 85-86. They finished at 17-57-6. 40 points. Miserable team. And their general manager's Jim Devellano. Now, Jim Devellano will get a lot of credit later on. He, Brian Murray, Ken Holland combine to create a Detroit Red Wings franchise that really, in all honesty, is a dynasty in the late 90s. But mid-80s, it's a laughingstock. And 85-86 didn't make it look any better than it had going in. Now, in 84-85, they finished with 66 points. They go, all right, we need a new coach. They bring in Harry Neale. Harry Neale had been directing the Vancouver Canucks at some level, whether as coach or GM, since the turn of the decade, so 79-80, but with no success. Now, in Harry Neale's defense, he had nothing in Vancouver. When you look at that roster and then you compare it with like the Oilers of the early 80s, there really wasn't much chance of Vancouver doing a whole lot. They couldn't get to 500, and Harry Neale did his best. And he would go on to become a great analyst. It was absolutely fantastic. But had a miserable start to the season with Detroit. They would go 0-8-1 out of the gate. Now, right there, you're done. Even in a 21-team league where 16 make the playoffs, you can't start 0-8-1. At the 20-game mark, they were 4-12-4. So they were 500 after their 0-8-1 start, but they weren't getting any closer to 500, and eventually that fall would continue. They allowed 8 or more goals 10 times. Now, I understand this is the 80s, and people will point out, well, it's the 80s. There's a lot of goals scored, yes. But allowing 8 or more goals every 8 games, it's really a recipe for disaster. And, in a league where the Oilers will routinely hit 9, 10, 12 goals, the Oilers would score the most goals against Detroit of anybody that year. The Oilers would win that game late in the year, 12-3. And it underlines just how poor the defense is for Detroit and that their goaltending probably needs to get better. And the following season, there's an improvement. And that's the thing. This is the darkest before the dawn. Harry Neale, under his direction, they go 8-23-4, and then they relieve him of his duties. They're like, okay, this isn't working. They bring in Brad Park as an interim. 9 wins, 34 losses, and 2 ties for Brad Park. Not really a better record, but it just wasn't working under Harry Neale. The captain that year was Danny Gare. Danny Gare didn't play a full season. His scoring totals dropped quite a bit from where they were at his height of his career. And as captain, he would hand that off to somebody really, really important to the Detroit fan base and to the organization. But it's not Yzerman's turn yet. In fact, Yzerman only played 51 games that year due to injury. 14 goals, 28 assists, 42 points. These are low totals. And coming out of that season, everybody talking about Detroit and their misfortunes, there was certainly talk about, well, is Yzerman going to be the guy? And that conversation won't go away until he wins the Stanley Cup. Gallant, 52 games played, 20 goals, 19 assists, 39 points, and one of the toughest guys in the league. Oh, speaking of toughest guys in the league, there's Bobby Probert, who at the age of 20 plays 44 games, 8 goals, 13 assists, 21 points, and he puts up a lot of penalty minutes and makes a name for himself. Now, the fact that these guys don't play more than the highest number of games played is 52 shows you that some of their best players just aren't in the lineup. And the following season, that definitely gets fixed, where Yzerman goes up in his point totals, and Gallant has one of the best offensive seasons of his career the following year. But what we're talking about is 85-86, and how miserable that is. Goals for, they're 21st in the league in goals against. They're also 21st in the league of 21 teams. Goaltending, Greg Stefan would bounce back from this season, and he would get help. He would have a backup that could play a ton in Glenn Hanlon. It's Greg Stefan, Glenn Hanlon. Greg would be like his cousin. I don't need to invent any more players, right? So Glenn Hanlon will join the team and have a decent run and helps to stabilize their goaltending. But Stefan came out of this season with an .856 save percentage and 4.51 goals against. And before you zero in on that and say, wow, that's miserable, Mark LaForest had an .845 save percentage and a 4.96 goals against. Eddie Mio, who's at the end of his career, .816 save percentage and a 6.33 goals against. And Corrado Mikalev, .848 save percentage, 5.54 goals against, and one of the greatest names in hockey history, Corrado Mikalev. And so with these four goalies, it just doesn't work with any of them. Stefan, as I said, will bounce back, and in the following season, he had a pretty decent run when they made the playoffs. And at this point, they're not even thinking about it. Now, their leading scorer this season is John Ogrodnik, 38 goals, 32 assists, 70 points. Kelly Kissio had 61 points. Reed Larson is notable as the top-scoring defenseman, 19 goals, 41 assists, 60 points. Peter Klima, 32 goals, 24 assists, 56 points, will have a Stanley Cup ring as a member of the 1990 Oilers. And it's not the only Oilers link. Danny Gare, after this season, would go over and retire after a season with the Edmonton Oilers. Adam Oates, no Oilers click there. However, he played 38 games, 9 goals, 11 assists, 20 points. Would play a full season the following year. I didn't put him in this category because this, to me, is your three core forwards for them of this roster. And Oates, of course, would be traded to St. Louis for Bernie Federko. That trade proving that every general manager has a trade that they regret in their past. Adam Oates was a key guy the following season, but I guess they felt that they wanted to go for it and that they could really do something. Because after this season, things come together pretty darn quickly for the Detroit Red Wings. So, with them finishing this poorly, who did they draft? Well, at number 1, they draft Joe Murphy. Joe Murphy, of course, would end up with the Oilers in 1990 on the kid line, Stanley Cup. Adam Graves is drafted at number 22. He ends up with the Oilers, kid line, Stanley Cup. And, of course, they were acquired in the trade by the Oilers that saw Jimmy Carson go to the Detroit Red Wings. A trade which didn't really work out for the Wings. Jimmy Carson was one of the greatest examples of a guy who comes into the league and just takes over and then disappears. Not that long after. Tim Cheveldae, drafted at 64th overall, he would become their starter at a later date. Number 85, Johan Garpenlov, would become more known during his time in San Jose and definitely in Florida as one of the guys who laid the groundwork for good teams later on. But you know, he did start off in Detroit, and he was pretty good. And I remember when Garpenlov and Fedorov were part of that team as young guys, that people were kind of excited about both. Obviously, Fedorov was going to be the better one, but Johan was seen as being a pretty darn good forward as well. One notable moment in this season is that Ron Duguay had been part of this team. Was putting up decent point totals and got traded to Pittsburgh for Doug Shedden, which is another weird trade. But Ron Duguay would never really get back to that offensive. How do I put this? His offense would drop following this season, and he would kind of peter out. Ron Duguay was known more for his hair and who he was dating off the ice than anything else, which is funny because eventually we'll cover Ron Dugay's career in a video. And he was actually a pretty good player, but he was known for his off-ice antics as much as anything else. 86-87, the year after this, Detroit fixes it. They hire Jacques Demers, who is, no offense to Harry Neal or Brad Park, much better coach and makes this team much better. They would improve by 38 points the year after this one, and they named Yzerman as captain. And Yzerman as captain rewarded them with 31 goals, 59 assists, 90 points. Gallant was close to a point a game the following season, playing the full year. And, of course, Probert would become one of the best power forwards in the game and probably the toughest player to ever play the game. That's all, it's all subjective, but yeah, he would definitely be considered one of the toughest players ever to play the game. They would get to the semifinals in 87. They did it again in 88 as well. So Detroit becomes the best in what was a bad division. The Norris division was arguably awful. And eventually I'll discuss the 86-87 Norris division and point out where it was just kind of bad. But You deal the hand you're dealt. So the fact that Detroit's able to get through 2 rounds and get the conference final in 87 shows that they were much better than this team. They made the playoffs 4 times between 1967 and 1986. And to put into perspective how bad that is, this, again, is a league where 16 out of 21 teams make the playoffs, and Detroit still manages to be one of those 5 teams who struggle to do so. After this season, from 87 through until, I want to say 3 years ago, I think they only missed the playoffs once. So there is a complete change in this franchise. Devellano gets a lot of credit for helping to turn it around, but boy, did he inherit a bad situation in 1982. The first, I want to say 4 years under Jimmy Devellano, things look kind of perilous and hectic, and then all of a sudden, everything gets better. This is why when people point out general managers, no, look at the record, just give it some time. Just give it some, you've got to let a general manager really make the roster in the image he's looking for, and sometimes that takes a while. In the following season, they do win and they get to the conference finals. That's the first time they'd won a series since 1978. That win in 1978 was the first series win they'd had in a while. So Detroit would become one of the most respected, revered organizations during the mid to late 90s. But man, in the 80s, not so much. And that dates back to the 70s as well. I've got plenty of articles and magazines and books dating back to the 70s and the early 80s on just how poorly thought of the Detroit Red Wings were. And when we look at teams now and we look at attendance, no, this team should move and that team should move. Guarantee you there would have been people who said, man, Detroit just looks like they're just dead out there. Bad arena, bad situation, bad organization, and I don't know if they're going to make it. But they did. They made it through this season and they'd be much better. But this was an interesting season because of that bad start and because they went through 2 coaches, neither of whom were able to get to double digits in wins. 17 wins that year. 3 years down the road, that's all kind of forgotten, and Detroit's building towards what they would become in 1997 as a Stanley Cup champion. But I thought it would be fun to look back at the 1985-86 Red Wings and where that team came from. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for your support and for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.